What if the food programs designed to help people were actually doing something else? Not in an obvious way, not in a way that anyone announced, but quietly, through records that don't fully align, and through outcomes that don't quite match what was promised. That question might seem small at first. It might even seem unreasonable. But once you start looking at the details, it becomes surprisingly difficult to dismiss. These programs were presented as humanitarian efforts, science-backed, carefully designed to address malnutrition in vulnerable populations around the world. And on the surface, that description appears accurate. Resources were deployed. Food was distributed. Reports were published showing improvement. The official record looks clean. But the official record and the full record are not always the same thing. And this is where the explanation starts to weaken. Here's the detail that doesn't fully make sense. Across different countries, different decades, and completely different populations, certain nutrition programs produced results that looked almost identical. The foods were different. The health conditions were different. The cultural backgrounds were different. And yet the outcomes followed the same pattern, almost as if they were designed to. In science, when two completely different experiments produce the same result, that usually means something. It means there's a shared variable somewhere. But in this case, no one has clearly identified what that variable is. Some researchers have raised this point. A few have written about it in detail. But the response has generally been the same: coincidence, or methodology differences, or early limitations in data collection. Those explanations are offered quickly, and the conversation tends to close just as fast. But here's the thing about coincidences. They don't usually repeat themselves this consistently, across this many programs, over this many years. And when an explanation is offered too quickly, without fully addressing the question, that itself is worth noticing. The topic doesn't disappear simply because it gets labeled as misunderstanding. The pattern remains. The records remain. And the gap between what was reported and what the data actually shows remains open. This raises questions that the official version hasn't fully answered. Not questions about whether the people running these programs had bad intentions. Not questions about whether nutrition science itself is flawed. The question is simpler and harder at the same time. Why do the results look the way they do? And why has that question received so little serious attention? The records exist. The inconsistencies are documented. And somewhere in that space between the official explanation and the actual data, something remains unclear. The accepted version of this history is relatively straightforward. Governments and international organizations identified populations suffering from malnutrition. Scientists stepped in, developed intervention programs, and began distributing food aid, supplements, and fortified products to communities in need. Health indicators improved. The programs were reviewed, evaluated, and declared successful. That is the version recorded in official reports, referenced in textbooks, and repeated in public health literature for decades. And on the surface, it holds together reasonably well. There is no obvious reason to question it. At first, it seems normal that early programs would rely on the best available science of their time. Methods improve. Standards change. What was considered reliable measurement in the mid-20th century is not always what researchers would use today. That explanation is fair, and it accounts for some of the gaps. But this is where it becomes unclear. When independent researchers went back to examine the original data from several of these programs, not the published summaries, but the actual raw records, what they found was unexpected. The health markers being used to measure success were not simply outdated. In several cases, they were measuring things that had a limited connection to the nutritional outcomes the programs claimed to be addressing. Weight gain was recorded. Certain visible symptoms were noted. But deeper indicators, the ones that would give a clearer picture of genuine long-term health, were either not collected or not included in the final reports. That raises questions, not necessarily about the intentions of the people running these programs, but about what was actually being measured, and whether the results being reported reflected what was truly happening in those communities. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the populations that showed the most dramatic recorded improvements were also, in many cases, the ones with the least access to independent verification. No separate research teams. No outside observers with full data access. The results came from within the programs themselves. Some scientists argue this was simply a product of the era. Resources were limited, and independent oversight wasn't standard practice. Others disagree. They point out that the pattern of weak measurement combined with limited outside access appears too consistently across too many programs to be explained by circumstance alone. So what were these programs actually tracking? And more importantly, what were they choosing not to track? The official record presents outcomes, but outcomes require reliable measurement. And when the measurement itself is questionable, the outcomes become harder to accept at face value. The story looks clean from a distance. Up close, the details are less settled than they appear. To understand why any of this matters, it helps to go back further, not to the programs themselves, but to the period when the science behind them was first being built. Modern nutrition science did not appear fully formed. It developed gradually, across several decades in the early 20th century, as researchers began identifying vitamins, mapping deficiencies, and testing how dietary changes affected the human body. The frameworks they created during that period became the foundation that governments and international organizations would later rely on when designing large-scale public health interventions. So the origins of that foundation matter. And when you look at them closely, the picture is a little more complicated than it first appears. At first, it seems normal that science would develop alongside the priorities of its time. Every field does. Researchers work within the environments they exist in, and those environments shape the questions they ask. But this is where it becomes unclear. The early 20th century was not a neutral period for population health research. Governments were actively interested in the physical and cognitive capacity of their populations. Militaries needed stronger, more resilient recruits. Industrial economies wanted workforces that were healthier and more productive. These were not background concerns. They were active priorities, and they influenced where research funding went and what questions were considered worth answering. Nutrition science grew inside that environment. That doesn't make the science dishonest, but it does mean that from the very beginning, the field was shaped by goals that extended beyond basic human well-being. Some of the early studies reflect this clearly. Rather than measuring broad health outcomes across communities, certain research focused narrowly on performance, physical strength, endurance under stress, cognitive function in controlled conditions. These were useful measurements for governments and institutions with specific operational goals. They were less useful for understanding the full health picture of ordinary people living ordinary lives. That distinction is important, and it doesn't fully disappear when you trace the line forward to the larger programs that came later. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Those large-scale interventions, the ones distributed across nations and populations, were built directly on the scientific frameworks developed during this earlier period. If those frameworks were shaped by questions beyond basic health, then the programs constructed from them may have carried those same underlying questions forward, whether intentionally or not. That is not a confirmed conclusion. The connection is not simple or direct. But when you look at the timeline carefully, the relationship between the early research priorities and the later program designs doesn't fully disappear either. It just becomes harder to see. This is where the first real inconsistencies begin to appear. And they are not minor details. Several large nutrition programs from the mid-20th century share a specific feature that is genuinely difficult to explain under the standard humanitarian model. The populations selected to receive intervention were not always the ones in the most critical condition. In some documented cases, program administrators chose relatively healthier communities over populations that were more severely malnourished and arguably in far greater need. For a program whose stated purpose was addressing nutritional suffering, that selection pattern is worth pausing on. At first, it seems normal that large organizations would face practical constraints. Logistics matter. Political access matters. You cannot run a program in a region where infrastructure doesn't exist or where local conditions make distribution impossible. Official records do offer these kinds of justifications: stable political environments, accessible locations, available local support systems. These are reasonable explanations, and they account for some of the decisions. But this is where it becomes unclear. They do not account for all of them. In several documented instances, the selection criteria applied by program administrators were never fully disclosed in the materials made available to the public. The official documentation lists outcomes and distributions. It does not always explain why specific communities were chosen over others with more visible and severe need. What makes this harder to set aside is what emerged later. Internal memos and administrative records, some declassified over time, others surfaced through academic research, suggest that the reasoning behind certain selection decisions was more complex than logistical convenience. In at least a few cases, these documents point toward priorities that were not reflected in the public-facing purpose of the programs. What those priorities were exactly, and who directed them, is not fully clear from the available record, but their existence raises questions that the standard explanation doesn't comfortably absorb. Some historians have looked at this pattern and described it as bureaucratic inefficiency. Large organizations operating across borders, under pressure, with limited coordination, mistakes happen, priorities shift, decisions get made for imperfect reasons. That explanation is plausible, but others have pushed back on it, pointing out that the deviations in selection logic were too consistent across too many separate programs to be the result of ordinary organizational disorder. Random inefficiency produces random patterns. This pattern was not random, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because if the selection decisions weren't driven purely by need, and weren't simply the result of logistical constraint, then something else was shaping them. What that something was remains an open and unanswered question in the existing record. At first, it seems normal that a large international program would collect health data from its participants. That is standard practice in any serious public health effort. You establish a baseline before the intervention begins. You measure relevant indicators. You apply the program. Then you measure again and track what changed. That process is how results get verified and how programs justify their continued funding. So the fact that these nutrition programs collected data is not surprising. What is surprising is what kind of data was collected, and what happened to it afterward. Researchers who have gone back to examine internal records from several mid-century programs found something that doesn't fit neatly into the standard model. Certain categories of data were collected consistently across multiple programs, but were never included in the official reports distributed to governments and the public. Blood work appeared in internal documents, but not in published findings. Behavioral observations were recorded in detail but never surfaced in any formal review. And perhaps most unexpectedly, neurological assessments were conducted, standardized evaluations of cognitive and neurological function, that have no obvious connection to the stated goal of addressing nutritional deficiency. This raises questions that are difficult to answer simply by pointing to the era or the available technology of the time. Why would a nutrition program need detailed neurological data? That question has been raised by more than one independent researcher reviewing these records. The responses from official sources and institutional representatives have generally been vague. Broad health monitoring, general scientific interest, baseline comparisons for future research. But this is where it becomes unclear. Those explanations might account for occasional or informal data collection. They do not easily account for what was actually found. The neurological assessments were not casual observations. They were detailed, they were standardized, and they were applied across different programs, operating in different countries, using the same measurement frameworks. That level of consistency and coordination does not emerge from general scientific curiosity. It suggests something more deliberate, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Some believe the data was simply collected and never properly analyzed, lost in the administrative complexity of large organizations operating across decades. Others disagree, arguing that coordinated data collection at this scale, using shared frameworks across independent programs, points clearly toward a coordinated research agenda with a specific purpose. Both positions exist in the current literature. Neither has been fully resolved. What that agenda was, who designed it, and who had access to the results remains unclear. The full records, in many cases, have still not been made available for independent review, and that absence is itself a detail worth holding on to. What makes all of this harder to dismiss is not any single detail. It is the repetition. One inconsistency in one program could reasonably be explained as an error. One gap in documentation could be attributed to poor record keeping. One unusual selection decision could be the result of circumstance. But that is not what the record shows. The same patterns appear across multiple programs, different organizations, different regions, different decades, and yet the same categories of unpublished data keep surfacing in internal documents. The same unexplained gaps appear between what administrators recorded privately and what was reported publicly. The same selection irregularities show up in program after program. At a certain point, repetition stops looking like coincidence and starts requiring a different explanation. Researchers who study the history of international health programs have noted something that adds another layer to this picture. Many of these initiatives, despite appearing to be separate and independent, shared more than just similar methods. They shared funding structures. They shared advisory board members. In some cases, they shared the same individual personnel moving between programs across different countries and organizations. The same institutional names appear repeatedly in the background of programs that were publicly presented as distinct efforts with different sponsors and different goals. At first, it seems normal that scientific communities would overlap in this way. These fields are not large. Funding sources are limited. Collaboration is common and often necessary. That explanation is reasonable as far as it goes. But this is where it becomes unclear. Shared personnel and overlapping funding do not, on their own, explain why the same specific emissions appear so consistently. Normal scientific collaboration produces shared methods, shared findings, shared publications. It does not reliably produce identical gaps across independent programs over several decades. If these were genuinely separate initiatives connected only by professional overlap, the inconsistencies should look different from program to program. They should reflect individual decisions and local circumstances. Instead, they follow a pattern that looks less like independent variation and more like a shared template. That distinction matters, and it doesn't fully make sense under the collaboration explanation alone. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. When researchers have raised this pattern directly, presenting the overlapping structures and the consistent emissions as a connected set of questions, the response from official sources and institutional representatives has generally followed the same approach. Attention gets redirected toward the documented benefits of the programs. The genuine improvements in health outcomes get emphasized. Those benefits are real and worth acknowledging. But acknowledging benefits is not the same as addressing inconsistencies. And redirecting attention is not the same as providing an explanation. The pattern remains. The question of what connects it remains open. At this point in the investigation, several different interpretations of the evidence exist. None of them are fully proven. None of them can be dismissed entirely either. What makes this stage of the inquiry unusual is that each interpretation explains part of the picture, but none of them explains all of it. And that gap, the space between what each theory accounts for and what it leaves unresolved, is where the real difficulty sits. The first interpretation holds that these programs were genuine public health efforts, real in their humanitarian purpose, real in the benefits they produced, but that they were also used, secondarily, as opportunities to collect population-level data, not to cause harm, not with hidden destructive intent, but because researchers believed that large-scale programs operating across diverse populations offered a rare chance to gather information that would be difficult to obtain any other way. Under this view, the lack of transparency was less about concealing wrongdoing and more about protecting institutional research interests. Some believe this explanation covers most of the inconsistencies reasonably well. But this is where it becomes unclear. It doesn't fully explain why certain data was collected so consistently, across so many separate programs, using standardized frameworks that suggest prior coordination rather than opportunistic collection. The second interpretation moves closer to something more deliberate. It suggests that certain programs were more directly connected to government research agendas, specifically in areas touching on cognitive function, behavioral compliance, and performance under controlled conditions, and that nutrition served as a legitimate entry point into a broader investigative framework. Under this view, the humanitarian component was real but not the complete picture. Others disagree with this reading, arguing that the available evidence doesn't support conclusions that specific, and that the interpretation reaches beyond what the documents actually confirm. The third view is the most cautious. It holds that the evidence is genuinely incomplete, that records were poorly maintained over decades, that institutions changed and priorities shifted, and that drawing firm conclusions from missing documents and internal memos is simply unreliable. Many researchers stay close to this position, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because caution is reasonable, but it doesn't make the patterns disappear. The inconsistencies existed before any interpretation was applied to them. They exist independently of what anyone concludes about their meaning. What's notable is that none of these three interpretations fully accounts for every detail in the record. Each one resolves certain questions and leaves others open, and the individuals closest to the original programs, those who are still living, have offered very little comment on any of it. That silence raises questions of its own. So where does all of this leave us? After reviewing the selection patterns, the unpublished data, the shared institutional structures, and the gap between internal records and public reporting, what can actually be said with confidence? The programs existed. That is not in question. The records exist, at least the portions that have been made available. The inconsistencies have been documented by independent researchers working across different institutions with no shared agenda. The patterns are real. They are not the product of selective reading or motivated interpretation. They are present in the material itself. And yet, what those patterns ultimately mean remains genuinely unclear. This is where the investigation reaches its most honest and most uncomfortable point. 3 broad possibilities have been considered. The programs were exactly what they claimed to be, with imperfections and irregularities that appear suspicious in retrospect but were ordinary and unremarkable for their time. Or they were something more deliberate, research initiatives that operated under a humanitarian framework while pursuing additional goals that were never disclosed to the public or to the participants themselves. Or the truth sits somewhere between those 2 positions, messier and less defined, shaped by competing priorities and institutional pressures that don't reduce cleanly to either innocent error or deliberate concealment. But this is where it becomes unclear. The available evidence does not resolve that question. Each possibility remains open. None can be confirmed, and none can be fully eliminated. What the evidence does suggest, carefully and without overstatement, is that the official history of these programs is not complete. There are gaps in the record where gaps should not reasonably exist. Data was collected and never published. Decisions were made without clear justification appearing anywhere in the documentation. Selection criteria were applied without full disclosure. These are not minor administrative footnotes. They are structural features of the programs, repeated across time and geography. That doesn't prove wrongdoing. It doesn't confirm that harm was intentional or that the humanitarian goals were false. But it does mean that the story presented publicly, clean, well-intentioned, straightforwardly beneficial, was not the whole story. Something else was present in these programs. The records suggest that much, even when they stop short of explaining what that something was. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult in the most lasting way, because the question of what exactly happened, and why it was never fully explained, and why the complete records have not been made available, remains open. It has not been seriously pursued at the scale it deserves. Whether that changes, and what a more complete investigation might reveal, is something the existing record cannot answer. Not yet.